Okay, so good afternoon. I have with me, as you can see, Police and Corrections Minister Tolley, and we're announcing some new initiatives to target gang crime and reduce the harm it causes to families and communities. So I'll just say a few things as per normal on that, just give you a little bit of update on what I'm doing for the rest of the week. Pass to Anne, she can say a few words, then we'll take any questions you've got on that, then she'll leave and we can take questions on anything else, so normal drill. Our government is committed to making progress on the really difficult issues that affect our communities, families and particularly our most vulnerable. And the good news is we're starting to see some very good results. As you're aware, crime is on a 35-year low. Recorded crime has fallen by over 20% in the past 4 years, and reoffending is now down by over 12%. Violent crime, however, is decreasing at a much slower rate. Our government is working hard to address that. For example, last month we announced a new package of initiatives to address family violence. Today we're announcing a new whole-of-government approach to target gang crime. Last year, serious offending by gang members increased by 15%. Gang members make up just 0.1% of our population, but we're responsible for 25% of all homicide charges. Almost half of the serious offences committed by gang members were family violence related. Stepfathers with gang connections were involved in more than half of all child homicides between 2009 and 2012. A high proportion of gang members' children repeatedly suffered abuse or neglect. We also know children born into gang families have a much higher chance than other children of becoming young offenders. So it's not enough just to target gang members, we have to help them and their families break free from gang life. That means getting off drugs, getting an education and gaining work skills so that they can hold down a job. Today I'm announcing 4 new measures that will expand law enforcement, strengthen legislation and help families remove themselves from gang life. Firstly, we're establishing a multi-agency gang intelligence centre to monitor gang activity. Secondly, we'll be introducing a number of social initiatives to help gang members and their families break away from gangs and prevent young people from joining gangs. Thirdly, we'll be setting up 2 new task forces. One is to strengthen border protection and will target drug trafficking and restrict international gang travel. The other is to revenue task force to prevent gangs profiting from crime. And lastly, we'll also review firearm laws, looking at freezing bank accounts for those convicted of drug trafficking and look at introducing drug dogs at key domestic ports. Gangs don't need to be a fact of life in New Zealand. They are criminal organisations that inflict harm on anyone who comes into contact with them. Our government is taking action to stop them and help them and their families break free from gang life. Just before I pass over to Anne, just in terms of my activities this week, I'm in Auckland tomorrow, in Mana and Paraparaumu on Wednesday, Christchurch on Thursday, and I'm back in Auckland again on Friday. So Anne, we'll just pass to you.
Thank you. Can I start by acknowledging the fantastic work of our police in reducing crime rates, but now we're actually getting down to the nitty-gritty, the crime which is much more difficult to prevent and to tackle. So if we're really serious about bringing crime rates down even further, then we do need to address gangs. And yes, police have had some success, some considerable success in dealing with gang operations, but the evidence shows that these organisations are trying to expand and that while overall crime is decreasing, serious offending by gang members is increasing, as the Prime Minister said, up 15% in 2013. And the damage that these people cause to communities and to their victims through violent crime and through drug supply and manufacture is horrendous. But they are also creating victims in their own homes through family violence and through neglect of their own children. The reality is that we cannot arrest our way out of this issue. So law and order is only part of the answer. It is an extremely complex issue, and we need to take a much smarter long-term approach using all of our government's agencies, tying this in with other programs such as Whānau Ora, Vulnerable Children, our Family Violence Package and our drive to reduce reoffending. So by the end of 2015, a multi-agency gang intelligence centre led by police and based at police national headquarters will collect and combine intelligence on real-time gang activity to support investigation, prevention and enforcement operations, whilst also identifying the vulnerable children and family members who may need social service support and making sure then that they get that support. It will also identify youths at risk of joining gangs so that agencies can then target their interventions. You'll all be aware, of course, of our focus on prisoner rehabilitation, and Corrections will strengthen its work around gang prisoner reintegration and rehabilitation programs with access to violence and addiction services and support to access training, education, employment and housing, possibly in new locations away from gang life. Safety planning and support will also be provided to women with gang connections who are at risk of family violence on release from prison. Agencies will work with local government, with community providers, local businesses and iwi to develop local social initiatives, alongside the work that's already being done by neighbourhood policing teams, to develop community events and activities with health and education services. And these events will act as the drivers to allow agencies to offer their support for gang families and other families who need them. As the Prime Minister's outlined, we're establishing 2 multi-agency dedicated enforcement task forces. The Outlaw Motorcycle Gang Border Protection Task Force will target drug trafficking networks to disrupt new gangs trying to enter New Zealand and restrict international gang travel. The Criminal Asset Confiscation Task Force will strengthen asset recovery efforts, prevent financing of crime and target profits received from crime. We're changing legislation to allow for 24-hour GPS monitoring of high-risk gang members, and we're also going to look at current legislation to see if it can be strengthened. So we've asked officials for options around possible firearm prohibition orders, which could prohibit serious gang offenders from possessing or obtaining firearms, and also penalise anyone who knowingly supplies firearms to someone who is subject to an order. We'll look at interim freezing orders on bank accounts and cash, and possible unexplained wealth laws for those convicted of drug trafficking or similar offences. We're also going to receive advice on a possible pilot of drug detector dogs at key domestic air and maritime ports to prevent and disrupt drug trafficking between the North and South Islands. Now that officials and ministers are working together on this, I'm sure that more ideas are going to flow. As I've said, not one approach on its own is going to give us the long-term results that we want, which is less harm caused by gangs in our communities and to their own families. But I think this is a pretty comprehensive plan to start with, and it's a very good start.
So you're essentially talking about increasing spying on gangs so that we know what they're up to?
What we're talking about is having real-time intelligence that's fed from right across government.
And how will you get that intelligence?
Well, it's a matter of sharing information.
But I mean, what I'm getting at is, are you going to increase the amount of surveillance and undercover operatives or whatever it is to get that information?
No, not necessarily, but when you sit around the table, as we've found over the last 18 months, and the different agencies start sharing the work that they're doing, actually they find that they are often working with the same people under their different agencies' activities. And so the intelligence centre is about putting all of that in the one place, so we get a very good picture on the ground of what's happening.
So you mentioned a GPS monitoring. Can you explain a bit more about that?
That's to be put, and that links in with the domestic violence. So that's high-risk offenders who are released from prison and who are in danger of going where the court has probably put an order that they are not to mix with other gang members. So it enables us to keep track of where they are to make sure, again, that they are not going back straight into their life of gang membership and activities.
To qualify for that surveillance, Will a further court order be required?
Yes, yes.
And how will you restrict international travel? Is that cancelling passports?
Yeah, so we currently have, from time to time, customs and police are notified of or work together to try and identify the movement of some of those international gang members. These will be permanent task forces who are working with overseas, particularly with Australia. We already have agreements around criminal history sharing, and so it's to make sure that we know when some of those international gangs are targeting us. We know we have problems around gangs like the Rebels in Australia coming in here seeking to set up and conduct their activities.
How will you attach the GPS tracking thingies to them?
The electronic bracelets,
That's right.
that's the normal, yeah.
Do they just confine to, you mentioned GPS in the context of domestic violence, is that just gang members domestic violence, or, because I know that from the figures you gave earlier, the big portion, there's also a lot of that.
Yes, no, it's linked with the announcements we made around domestic violence. So yes,
So
some
it's not
high-risk offenders for domestic violence, but also some high-risk offenders for other forms of violence or activities like drug manufacture, drug distribution, that those gang members are taking part in.
Jumping across to that one, because you mentioned several times there the financial aspect and assets accumulated, and one about the Australian, you mentioned the Rebels.
The Rebels.
Do you have any feel for how much money we're talking about here? Because anecdotally it could be huge.
Anecdotally, it is huge, and no, I can't tell you how many millions, but it's a very lucrative trade.
Do you know any estimates or anything on?
No, not to hand, no.
If you're talking about increased services to help out with domestic violence, does that mean National we're reversing its cuts that it's routinely done to those services over the past 6 years, such as rape crisis and women's refuge and so forth?
Well, I don't think it's right to say that we have cut. In fact, this government has put more money into those services. Maybe
well,
not that,
Christchurch is one just
not
shut
that particular
down,
individual one,
service.
but certainly into Auckland and into Wellington. So we announced a very comprehensive package last month on domestic violence that dealt with both intergenerational social issues and also from the justice sector, from both Mr Collins and myself, some prevention and intervention, and part of that was GPS on high-risk offenders.
The package, as you've outlined it, does sound primarily punitive. I wondered if you could indicate whether there's been what place in the thinking of the government, say, the role of modern subsidised work schemes may have.
Oh, look, I hope it doesn't sound too punitive because a lot of work has been done on the social intervention. So part of the Gang Intelligence Centre is about identifying who are the vulnerable children in our communities, who are the vulnerable young people. So the desire is to stop young people from joining gangs, and there will need to be a lot of research, a lot of collaborative work put into that. Now, some of that is about certainly about education, skills training, and helping them get into employment and then supporting them in employment.
So are there any new initiatives in that area of job incentives or job opportunities?
No, it's too early for that. What we have to do at this stage is you can imagine getting those agencies to put a slightly different focus on some of their existing work, activities like whānau ora, like the vulnerable children, so putting that gang lens over that will help us identify who those people are and the ones that we need to put the extra wraparound services who might need something different to support them in their communities simply because they are under the pressure of those belonging to those gangs.
But the intention is down the track to link it up with job incentives and job
could well be, but that might not be the answer for them. It's actually about getting what we've found is with particularly working with those in prisons, it's getting them good skills, some qualifications, and then support into a workplace and supporting them for a period of time in that workplace.
What sort of employment do you think would be suitable in terms of transitioning out of gang lifestyle?
Well, it depends on people's interests. What we're finding with prisoners is it's an enormous range from the creative through the trades. We've just got one prisoner who's off on his master in public policy. So, you know, it's the world's their oyster if we can get them interested in getting some qualifications and backing them and supporting them through into employment.
So you think the problem is lack of interest rather than lack of opportunity?
Sorry?
You think their problem is lack of interest in these skills rather than lack of opportunity?
No, I think it's, for many of them, it's with prisoners, it's clear that it's lack of opportunities.
Given the scale of activity some of these gangs have, I don't know if a number of them are registered for GST, but I'm just wondering if there's any sort of stepped up tax auditing activity part of the
Yeah, so Inland Revenue and Police have recently signed a memorandum of understanding that enables them to share some of that information because it is nonsensical if the Inland Revenue is aware that people are registered for and paying their tax for what are illegal activities, that they don't then report them to the police. And so one of those task forces, that's the Criminal Asset Confiscation Task Force, is between the police and Inland Revenue to examine exactly that.
Is it possible to see, you're saying we might see drug dogs in domestic airport terminals?
We'd like to pilot that. We know that there is considerable movement of drugs and particularly precursors between the North and South Island.
So that's
So
that
how
ferry
do you
terminals as
target
well?
that? How would it work?
Well, just as you see them at international airports, the beagles that go around sniffing luggage.
So ferry terminal as well?
Yes,
Is China still seen as the main source of the precursors?
it is one of our major areas, and I've just had recently come back from China. We're putting a second police liaison officer into Guangzhou, which is one of the big areas for the movement of precursors. So we're certainly stepping up our efforts in that part of the country.
Is
So-
it
so
fair
if,
to have,
um,
is it fair to have one system of penalties, or even presuming that gangsters are guilty by association, and something different for other criminals?
I don't think that's. I'm sorry if I haven't explained myself, but it's not intended that be the case. We have a criminal justice system that deals with a whole range of criminal activities.
So
So
you're
with
saying
the-
no guns for gang members, you're saying we'll look at
Oh, I
getting
see.
money
The
as
firearm.
Well, for any of those aspects that apply specifically to gang members rather than any other criminal.
Well, I think what we're trying to do is address some of the drivers of criminal activity in our communities, and we know that gang members feature in the stats that the Prime Minister read out. They feature greatly in violent crime, and in most of those, many of those cases, firearms are involved. So it's shooting where the ducks are.
And just
Have you checked whether there are any human rights or bill of rights issues?
Oh well, that's why a lot of this, where any legislation is put into place, it will need to go through, and the balance between the individual rights of criminals and the rights of the general public are always weighed very carefully through the select committee process.
So that hasn't been done yet, though, you don't
No, we haven't done any work for any new legislation.
Could these drug dogs at airports search anyone, i.e. someone carrying a small cannabis joint on a domestic flight? Would they be able to get picked up?
Well, we're very early.
Asking for
You're worried. We are at very early stages, but what I can tell you is that these dogs are quite intelligent. So with money, they have been trained to sniff out large amounts of money, $10,000 plus. So deliberately, so that they don't spot the people who've got $10 or $20 in their pockets. So I would imagine that they would be looking at doing similar. Look, we're not, the idea of this wouldn't be to catch the odd person that's got a cannabis joint in their pocket. We really want to get the guys at the top who are moving large amounts of drugs and precursors around the country.
So are you looking for the domestic version of Chappelle Corby?
Yes, I suppose you could put it like that. I don't know. She had quite a lot in her. Yeah.
And
terms of youth, identifying youth at risk of joining gangs, if that youth and their family aren't interested in whatever opportunities the government has to offer to sort of deviate them away from that path, will the government or the agencies back off them? Or because there might be a concern that they'll be subject to surveillance when they haven't really done anything wrong?
No, there's no intent to put them under constant surveillance. With all of these, we know you've got to offer the opportunities. You've got to have skilled people to work with them, develop relationships with them, but at the end of the day, it's their choices.
On the Gang Intelligence Centre, can you give us an idea of who will lead it, what types of agencies will be in it, and scale?
So the proposal is that it's police-led and it's based at Police National Headquarters. And the agencies who've been involved in this would MSD, Corrections, Housing, Inland Revenue, Customs, Te Puni Kokori, who I left out. That's about it. So all the social service agencies.
And the scale?
Oh well, we're talking at the moment we've got about 4,000 known gang members. Now we know that they're larger than that with associates, so it would be helpful to add into that. But I mean, you're not talking hundreds of thousands of people.
I'm talking about the actual violence, the Gang Intelligence Centre itself.
Yeah, well, I would imagine that what was intended. So we're talking about developing some ICT about $1.6 million. So it's not a very large organisation.
Just checking, so this will involve more monitoring and I guess spying and intelligence activities on gang members and their associates, more than you do now?
Yes, on their activities, yes.
So how much more, what are we talking about?
Well, we would ask, all those agencies would be sharing the information that they have on those identified gang members. So, for instance, corrections, when they're releasing someone from prison with a support package around them, say in employment, and they're a known gang, they're an identified gang member, that sort of information would go in. So it's not just about keeping track of the people, but also knowing what's happening to them and making sure then that if they do get into trouble, that there's good support around them. So, it has a positive and a negative.
Prime Minister, could I just ask you on this gangs, and you may have critics who say this is just electioneering, that you get tough on gangs to look like the government's dealing with violent crime problem?
Yeah, well, what we would say is we've been the government for 6 years now. Crime's on a 35-year low, but we know that gangs are at the forefront of the manufacture and distribution of drugs. They are the critical sort of distribution unit in New Zealand, and so naturally, having I think dealt with a lot of the low-hanging fruit when it comes to crime, if we're really serious about getting the crime rate lower, we have to go into where the more difficult issues are. And there's no question that gangs are very sophisticated these days. The days of them sort of having big punch-ups on Saturday night against each other are over, because that's not very good for business. Nowadays what they do is they're very sophisticated in their business activities, and I think you can see through both everything from domestic violence and family homicides right through to the drug issue. If we could make inroads into those gangs and severely curtail their activities, then from a New Zealand point of view, we're going to make the country safer.
But why not have done this earlier?
We have actually, so the Minister brought the proposal in a very early form about 8 or 12 months ago, that sort of window, to one of our strategy meetings. The police have been giving thought to this whole issue of how we could take a step change over the last couple of years, and we've been working through that proposal. It's a logical sort of third term issue for us if we get another term.
Prime Minister, may I move on to another topic?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
What did you make of Winston Peters' call at the weekend that the sale of Lochinvar Station would be a deal breaker for him?
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is that Winston Peters has already had quite a number of bottom lines, and I don't think bottom lines are very helpful for anybody, because in reality, when it comes to those negotiations, I think it's far more sensible to let the voters vote. We've tried to give an indication of the sort of mix of parties we think we can work with and then for the good of the country, try and structure what we think is a practical set of initiatives we can agree on for another term.
Would you actually do it though? Would you actually not, if the OIO approved the sale,
Right.
and it came down to putting the ministers putting the signatures on there, would you decline the sale for political reasons essentially? Would you be prepared to do that?
Okay, so there's a process we've got to go through, and we're very reluctant to get in front of that process. It has to go through the Overseas Investment Office. Ultimately, they need to make recommendations, and my understanding of the law is if ministers are going to reject it, they actually have to have a reason in law to reject it. The one point I would make though, and there's been a lot of comment in the last, obviously, 48 hours about this issue, is that I think there's not a lot of consistency coming from a great number of the opposition parties. So if you take, for instance, Lochinvar, yep, fair enough, Labour might say that they're opposed and Winston Peters might say it's a deal breaker. But back in 2007, Labour under Michael Cullen and David Parker agreed to the sale of Poronui Station. It's right next door to Lochinvar. It's 6,500 hectares. In fact, so proud of the sale were they that Labour actually went out there and asked themselves a parliamentary question, let alone put out a statement going on about how magnificent the benefits were. To quote Michael Cullen, which I don't often do, we welcome foreign investment that has real benefits for New Zealand. And then, I might add, by the way, that was in 2007 when Winston Peters was part of that Labour government. So we're, whatever it is, 46 odd days to an election, and I think most New Zealanders will say that some of the stuff will be whipped up and the intensity of it will be whipped up for election reasons rather than what actually in reality happens in government. So under my government, over the last 5 or 6 years, we've sold or allowed the sale of foreign land to foreigners at a much lower rate than Labour did. We actually toughened up the legislation in 2010, and we made stronger economic measures as part of the test. So I just think the opposition parties, particularly Labour and New Zealand First, got to answer the question, if it was okay back in 2007, why is it not okay for the station that's right next door today?
So in terms of 2010, you said at that time, and you'll remember,
Yep.
that you did not want New Zealanders becoming tenants in our
Correct.
own land. If the sale goes ahead, are we becoming tenants in our own land? Does this show that we are becoming tenants in our own land?
No, it doesn't. I mean, I don't know the total hectareage of New Zealand, but it's huge, and Lochinvar's it's a reasonably big size station. It's still very, very small. The international evidence shows that we have relatively low levels of foreign ownership of New Zealand rural and agricultural land. Now, I stand by the statement I said earlier. I think if there was a really serious run on New Zealand land, I think that would be unacceptable to most New Zealanders. And if we were the government, we would act to try and slow that down. But we've been allowing sales of land at a much slower rate than Labour ever did in the last 5 or 6 years of their government.
Would you be prepared to enter into discussions with a potential partner about further tightening up those rules?
Well, I mean, again, I'm not going to sort of conduct those discussions today. I mean, I personally think that the steps we took in 2010 to tighten up the Overseas Investment Act were the right ones. I think they put more economic tests on the table. The only point I'd make actually about foreign investment is the following. One, whatever the rules are, they have to be consistent. It can't be okay for an American company to buy, or okay for an Australian company to buy, or okay for a German company to buy, or entity, and not okay for a Chinese one. Because there's been plenty of sales of farmland in Southland and other sort of issues which have gone to buyers and no one's had anything to say about it. So consistency is firstly very important. Secondly, hundreds of thousands of New Zealand jobs are actually underpinned by foreign investment. So James Cameron has come to New Zealand and he's bought a number of properties in the Wairarapa. He's also going to produce Avatar 2, 3 and 4 in New Zealand. We know from The Hobbits that 5,000 plus jobs were created as a result of filming The Hobbits in New Zealand. So I didn't see the opposition parties screaming from the rooftops that James Cameron shouldn't be welcome to New Zealand and shouldn't be able to buy those properties. So in the end, I just think that we've all got to be a little bit careful in an election period that we don't lose sight of the fact that New Zealand imports a fair bit of capital and needs it.
Just coming back to that criteria. So you're saying that ministers just couldn't get, if for instance, if you win the election and it came down to this situation where there was a political reason to decline a sale, you're saying ministers couldn't do it for political reasons, could they?
Well, you can always try and create a reason, but if you go back to, and I'm sort of slightly testing my memory, but when the Canadian pension plan wanted to buy Auckland Airport, the then Labour government, I think, actually changed the law around sensitive land to allow them to reject the proposal under the Overseas Investment Act. I don't think you can just say, we don't like you because you're from China, or we don't like you because we need to stitch up and deal with another political party. You actually have to have a reason in law. Now, there's a coverall provision, I think, actually in the Act, which gives ministers some flexibility. But at the end of the day, we as a government have tried to be both predictable and consistent. And I think that's really important when it comes to foreign investors, because as I said, they actually at the core of all this underpin hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders' jobs.
Prime Minister,
the Abbott government is working on a national register of ownership of farmland, and the Federated Farmers thinks it's a good idea to do that here. They think it could possibly take the political sting out of the issue by finding out exactly how much land is overseas owned. Is that not a good idea?
Well, I think that register in a form would actually already exist, because the rules under overseas investment purchases are, I think, land in excess of 4.5 hectares and a value of a company in excess of a certain amount. So the bottom line is that farmland almost always has to go through the Overseas Investment Office, and therefore that's why we know through land information what's sold to foreigners and what isn't.
And
it's more difficult at a residential level, because it doesn't trigger often the Overseas Investment Act. It's more difficult to be precise, but when it comes to farmland, I think we already know that.
And what proportion of New Zealand farmland is foreign owned?
The last time I looked at Sunday Star Times ran an article, and the answer was very low. I think it was under 1%, but we'd have to have a look.
So you said that a government wouldn't allow a run on New Zealand land buying. What would you say would look like a run?
Well, I think it would be where we got to a level where people intuitively felt it was an extremely frequent event, which was challenging New Zealand's ownership of its underlying land. I mean, we've had investment coming from lots of countries in the past. I mean, this isn't new. I mean, in the 1970s it was Japan that came in and bought a lot of forestry land in New Zealand. Some of them have remained as very long-term holders. Quite often you see land actually changing hands. So a foreigner will buy it and actually sell it back to New Zealand. That's one of the reasons why it's difficult to know the exact number, because what ends up happening is we know what gets sold to foreigners. We just don't know what happens when foreigners sell it to a New Zealander, because that's not required under the Act to be triggered. But the bottom line is I don't think anyone could claim at the moment that we have an amount which is making New Zealanders tenants in their own land. My view would be it's one of those things you constantly monitor.
The Māori Party says that it will draft a bill banning the purchase of New Zealand land by foreign investors and take it to the negotiating table post-election if the votes fall that way. Will you entertain that discussion with them?
Well, as I said, I'm not going to have those discussions today, but everyone just has to be thoughtful in what they do, because for a start off, are we really saying we don't want to allow an Australian to buy a beach place in New Zealand, because that's on land, and by the way, we can in Australia. And is everyone saying that we don't want to have a German company buy another company in New Zealand, as Bayer did when it went and bought Mr. Apple in New Zealand, because at the end of the day, their pack houses are on land. So, all I can tell you is this thing is a minefield when you start getting into defining all of this stuff. What the evidence shows you is the amount of foreign ownership of land in New Zealand is still relatively small. It doesn't mean that position can't change, and if it does over time, governments might want to consider further movement in the Overseas Investment Act. We did that in 2010. Of course, that could always happen again in the future. And we're sympathetic to New Zealanders' views, but I just make the point that I think overall those numbers are very low, and overall New Zealand's tended to benefit from. I mean, you can go and take someone like Julian Robertson. Yep, he bought a farm that happened to be in Northland. It's called Cowrie Cliffs. It happens to be one of the most successful high-end luxury lodges. He's also giving the single biggest donation of art in Australasian history, and he's been a very substantial benefactor to New Zealand charities. So we're now saying we wouldn't want Julian Robertson in New Zealand. And that's where this thing becomes pretty tricky.
Are you concerned that two of your preferred coalition partners are taking such a strong position on the issue?
No, we're 46 days from an election, and the megaphone's going to go up on all sorts of issues over those next 46 days. We're going to present to New Zealanders, I think, a reasonably calm and sensible approach to a lot of these issues, because that's what's actually required.
The Greens have called for the Israeli ambassador to be expelled from New Zealand as of today.
Yep.
What do you make of that?
I wouldn't support that move. I mean, we are deeply concerned by what we're seeing taking place in Gaza, but at the end of the day, having an ambassador in New Zealand allows the New Zealand government to formally register its concerns where it sees those concerns, and we've done that, and on at least one occasion in the last couple of weeks we've formally called in the Israeli ambassador. If we send him home to Tel Aviv, then we don't have anyone we can register those concerns with.
We saw another school bombing overnight. Are you concerned that Israel is breaking international law?
Well, I'm horrified by what I see. I could repeat the comments I've made in the past, but look, in the end, we're seeing now well in excess of 1,000 people, 1,500 people, civilians, tragically killed, and an end's got to come to this senseless killing. But it's on both sides that the parties need to start talking.
Are you concerned that Israel has breached international law?
I don't have any advice to support that, and I wouldn't want to speculate on it.
So it hasn't been raised with the ambassador about issues to do with collective punishment under the Geneva Convention?
I don't know exactly the conversation that MFAT had with the ambassador. I just know he was called in last week.
Both Labor and the Greens have said that our response, or your response, has been weak, hasn't been strong enough. What do you say to that?
Yeah, well, as I said, we're 46 days from an election. Because, let's look at the reality of what's actually taken place. We formally tabled a motion in Parliament, and every political party supported that motion, and I don't think I saw any other political party in their response saying they didn't agree with the motion that the government tabled. So that was the first thing. Second thing is that we have supported the UN Security Council resolution. The third thing is we called in the Israeli ambassador, and even Labor don't support sending the Israeli ambassador home. So the question is, what more could we do? I mean, we are strongly voicing our distaste, and I've done that on numerous occasions. With the greatest respect to the TV channels, you guys haven't actually played my comments, but if you want to play them, then people will see how strongly I feel about the issue.
Back on July the 9th, Minister McCulley did call on the Israelis to exercise restraint proportionate to the threat that they faced. With hindsight over the last 3 weeks, do you think the Israeli response has been proportionate?
Well, I think people can see the utter carnage that's taken place and the enormous loss of life that's occurred largely on the Palestinian side. I mean, the problem with all of these things is we can sort of pick sides and pick whether responses are proportionate or fair. My own preference is to say, look, in the end, it's both Israelis and Palestinians that are dying here, and the position's not sustainable, because in the end it's either going to escalate and get worse, which is very worrying for the Middle East in general, or we've got to find a practical way through. And I can point fingers, but I think it's actually better to continue to do what we are doing and urge democracy, dialogue to take place.
You say people on both sides have been killed, but on the Israeli side it's largely been soldiers who are coming in, whereas, and it's been about 53 people in total, whereas the Palestinian one, as you said, is above 1,500. I mean, does Palestine not have a right to defend itself?
Well, I think the real issue isn't so much defending on either side. I mean, my preference is both of them stop. The real issue is the one I identified some time ago, which is, tragically for the Palestinians, most of those people are refugees and they don't have a place to go.
On the health sector, the unions have said there's going to be industrial action. Thousands of workers are opposed to the 0.7% payoff that they say they've got. Do you think 0.7% is correct or high enough, or are you concerned that the wage offers are not high enough?
Well, they're in the middle of negotiations, and at it's wrong with me to jump in front of those negotiations.
Australia said it's going to review the rules surrounding surrogacy internationally in the light of this case in Thailand. Are you aware of that?
Well, only vaguely, and only what I've
Okay.
seen in the media, so I really don't have anything to
Okay, I was
put
just
on
wondering if there's any interest on the New Zealand side of looking at this issue, seeing as it is becoming increasingly.
Look, I haven't received any advice on that, rather than jump into it.
Are you worried that the outlook for the economy is weakening?
No, I mean, in the end, you've still got commodity prices for dairy and the likes at very high levels. Look, overall, we still see a very strong outlook, and that's backed up by the Treasury and Reserve Bank's view of where growth is going. But there'll always be fluctuations. I mean, in the end, Fonterra did what you'd expect them to do, which was downgrade their payout on the best information they currently have. But that they themselves would say it would depend on a number of factors, including what their auction looks like going forward, and ultimately what happens to the exchange rate.
Are you concerned that 12,000 health workers may be striking?
Well, obviously we prefer that didn't happen, but those negotiations are happening with the appropriate government agency, state services or whatever, and it's not for me to get in front of the negotiations.
But would you hope that they would be quickly resolved though? Because I mean that surely could be a concern that you have thousands of health workers.
Well, we always hope that, yeah. We hope the parties can find a peaceful way through it. An agreeable way through it, probably. It's a good way to do it. I'm sure they're peaceful as well. You're good? Okay, thanks a lot.